Thanks for folks who are just joining in. We're just waiting for some more folks to join the call, and feel free to drop in your name or where you're calling in from. We can start to kind of see we have a lot of people registered from around the country. We're really excited. Hopefully make some connections, through everyone being here on the call together.
Yeah, if you could use the chat function to put in your name and organization and where you're calling in from.
Welcome, Sahara. Good to have you from Coachella.
And Henry is here from the Alameda County Community Food Bank. Welcome.
Hey, Jordan from One Love Global in Michigan.
And Jose Orellana from Loud for Tomorrow in Delano, California.
Hey, Jose. Good to see you. Look forward to talking more tomorrow.
Yeah.
Hey, Amelia from Blueprint, North Carolina. I think that's North Carolina, right?
Yeah, hey, Amelia.
That's Josh Clark. It's got no video, but.
Jen Christian Willoughby is here from Make the Road in Las Vegas. All right.
Welcome, Patricia from Coachella as well. Thank you for folks dropping in their pronouns as well. Appreciate that.
Catalina, she, her from We the People, Michigan. Hey, Jessica. It's good. Glad to see you on the call, on the video. I don't see you, but I see your name.
Cool. What else we got? Okay. Hey, Jessica. Welcome from St. Louis. Things are good there. All right. So again, just welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Just inviting people to share where they're coming from, their name, their pronouns, what organization they're repping in the chat box. If you'd like, my name's Evan. I work with the Othering and Belonging Institute alongside Olivia and Gerald, Josh, and Nilu. That's our team today, and we'll get into that in a moment. So we'll probably take just another minute, and then we'll jump into it. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Hey, Alan from Resilience OC. Welcome. Santa Ana, California in the house. And Victor joined us from Cali Calls in LA. All right. Welcome, Victor. Good to see you on.
Hey, Dulce. Also calling in from Resilience OC. Good to see you. Cool. All right.
And Polo is here from Cheerline, LA. Good morning, Sheila. Where are you from, Sheila? Olivia is shouting out to our homies from Santa Ana. Olivia is part of our team here at the Othering and Belonging Institute.
All right. So I think let's get started. Let's jump in. If people join, they'll catch up. And there's always the internet, so you can always go back and record and rewatch things. So thank you all for being here, being wherever you are, but being together through the digital space right now. Just real briefly, my name is Evan Bissell. I use he, him pronouns. I work at the Othering and Belonging Institute as the Arts and Cultural Strategy Coordinator. And my work, I have the great privilege of getting to work with a bunch of our different program areas. And one of those is working very closely with the Civic engagement team, which I'll let those folks just introduce themselves very briefly. And then we're going to pass you over to Nilu Amiri, who is who's running tech for this meeting. Thank you, Nilu. And Nilu will kind of give us a little bit of a grounding. We'll also drop in an agenda into the chat box if you'd like to just see kind of a broad overview of the agenda for today. This is a digital meeting, obviously, but understanding that we're all pretty much zoomed out 5.5 weeks into this shelter-in-place thing. We are going to try and keep it a little bit more interactive and try to do breakouts and get back together and all that kind of stuff. So please also have a pencil or a pen and some paper. We're going to be doing some actual physical writing. Just take your time to get that also. So maybe the other folks from the Othering and Belonging team, if you could just introduce yourselves, that'd be great. And Nilu, if you could just spotlight them when they talk.
So this is
go ahead, Gerald.
Okay, this is Gerald Lenoir. How's everybody? I'm with the Network for Transformative Change at the Othering and Belonging Institute, working on 2 projects. One is the Blueprint for Belonging project, which is a California statewide project, and then the Civic Engagement Narrative Change project, which is a national project where we're working with groups around the country. Glad everyone's here.
I guess I can go next. This is Josh Clark. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Can you hear me okay, Nilo? I have to talk using my phone. Okay, cool. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. I work with Gerald on both the projects you mentioned, Blueprint for Belonging in California and the Civic Engagement Narrative Change project in several states across the country. And I really live for opportunities like this to bring different partners from different regions and states together. I love connecting people because we work with cool people in so many different places, and often our conversations are region specific or state specific. So I'm really excited for this.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. This is Olivia Araiza. I'm the program director for the Network for Transformative Change. Hope you all are doing well. And for all of you or all of us that are mourning, our hearts are with you.
Great, thank you. Nilu, you want to give us some grounding for the tech as we move through?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Nilu. I am under the Othering and Belonging name today, but my name is Nilo if you need to reach out to me directly. What we would like to do, I know a few folks have already started introducing themselves in the chat box. If you can go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function there. We would love to hear from you. Please share your name, who you work with, your pronouns. Some folks have also been sharing, that's beautiful, and where you're located, just so we can start getting to know each other there. I'd also like to invite you to click the participants function in the bottom as well. From there, you have a few options and ways to interact with us, because you're all muted during the webinar and the presentation. You can, there's a few options in the bottom of the participant screen where you can click yes, no, go slower, go faster. And if you put your cursor over more, there's a thumbs down, a thumbs up, thumbs down, clap, need a break, away function there as well. If you click those, then I'll be able to see next to your name these little icons, and we'll have a better sense of where everyone's at. As well, if you have any questions or during times of engagement, if you want to give a thumbs up, then I'll know to unmute you if you have questions. And so that would be really helpful if you make use of those. And if you're not, if we're done with that, please also click clear all so that I know that you're no longer engaging with us in that way. And if you have any other questions, feel free to keep using the chat function. We would love to keep that active as well. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Nilu. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to pass it to Gerald. Gerald, I'm going to drop you into our thing here now. So let's do this. All right. So, all right. Let me get this going. Thank you for your generosity sitting with us as we move through this. So first, just briefly to review the goals of today, just introducing the Othering and Belonging Institute's cultural strategy framework. So we'll spend a bit of time doing that. We'll also identify ways that cultural strategy can strengthen civic engagement efforts. So looking at some of the intersection between cultural strategy and research around civic engagement. And then third, we'll spend some time exploring initial ideas for deepening or expanding cultural strategy. And hopefully we get some good seeds there that we can follow up with and think about, how to offer more resources moving ahead, maybe a follow-up webinar or something like that, so we can deepen into those ideas. So from there, I'm going to pass it over to Gerald to kind of speak to the framework for our civic engagement work at the Othering and Belonging Institute.
So Evan, we're not in present mode.
Can you see? Oh, you cannot see my screen?
I can see your screen, but it's not in present mode.
That's okay. I think that's where we're going to go from here.
Yeah, I don't think the video is going to show if it's not in present mode. There you go.
Okay.
So before we dive into Evan's presentation on cultural strategy, I just wanted to do a short presentation on some of the key concepts that are embedded in our cultural strategy work and in our work around civic engagement and indeed all of our work here at the Institute. So one of the main concepts is this notion of strategic narrative. So how we see it is it's an overarching narrative that incorporates vision, values, and an analysis of society, and that narrative points to a shared identity. So it's an overarching narrative. It's not a narrative simply for a campaign or for an issue, but it really speaks to those three components: vision, values, and analysis of society. And then applying in our work, then we have this the slide on the right, the three fundamental building blocks of a progressive meta-narrative or strategic narrative. At the center, we see inclusion and belonging. And in order to get to inclusion and belonging, we see the necessity of speaking to the elimination of racialized inequality, to promoting an inclusive and responsive government for all, and then this notion of empathy and bridging based identities, that is, shared identities across differences, particularly of race, but across all differences, gender, sexual orientations, and a whole range of identities. So that's kind of the conceptual framework and how we apply it in our work. Next slide. One of the most important parts of that is this notion of bridging. And this is a short video that kind of explains, some of you may have seen this video on bridging. So let's just show the video.
Of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming. We are in a period of accelerated change in at least 4 areas: globalization, technology, the environment, and demographic change. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety, which is a normal biological reaction. But how we respond to this anxiety is social. Our response is greatly shaped by the stories presented by leadership and through culture. These stories speak to our deepest values and our core beliefs about who we are, many of which operate at the subconscious level. We can respond to these changes either as a threat or as an opportunity. The first response is breaking. The second is bridging. Breaking can create a deep fear of other groups, making it easier to accept false stories of us versus them. Breaking perpetuates isolation, hardens racism, and builds oppressive systems, while driving our politics and institutions toward anti-democratic and inhumane practices. The other response is bridging, which calls on us to imagine a larger, more inclusive we. When we bridge, we see demographic change and our diverse identities as positive and enhancing who we are. Bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. Bridging does not mean abandoning your identity. Bridging means acknowledging our shared humanity, rejecting that there is a them, and moving toward a future where there is instead a new us. When we bridge, we not only open up to others, we also open up to changes within ourselves, where we can participate in creating a society built on belonging.
So that video kind of encapsulates what we think, particularly in this moment during this triple crisis, I would call it the pandemic, the economic crisis, and then the political crisis of leadership and that we're experiencing in this country. So I think that this notion of bridging is to really look at how we can create identities across difference, and we're seeing people bridging spontaneously in this moment. I just want to say a little bit about how we have been applying the notion of narrative and bridging in our work. So we've been doing a lot of work around analysis of the drivers of inequality. We've been developing messaging and narrative, working with our partners in 5 or 6 states across the country, and then doing trainings and curriculum with the curriculum modules that we developed around bridging, around strategic narrative, and around the notion of othering and belonging. And then we've been developing digital projects, particularly with California Calls. We've developed several digital products for social media that project a notion of bridging across difference and the role of government and the inordinate power of corporations. So those are some of the themes that of the videos. And then we've developed cultural strategy. We worked with Power California last year, or in 2018, on a project in 3 areas of California where we work with artists and cultural workers to develop projects in the Get Out the Vote projects that their organizations were involved in. And then, of course, research and analysis. So we did statewide surveys in California, Nevada, and Florida, looking at the drivers of inequality and what people think about inequality, what they think about intergroup relations, the role of government, the role of corporations, and around specific issues like immigration, police brutality, affirmative action. And so really to support civic engagement tables around the country as they develop narrative and messaging in their civic engagement work. So that is, in a nutshell, what our framework and analysis looks like and what our work looks like on the ground with groups across the country.
Great. Thank you, Gerald. So we're going to turn now just to take some time for folks to get to be in conversation with each other, and you know, just kind of have that moment. So obviously, you know, we want to ground a little bit in self and in community in this moment right now. And in our kind of recent collection of papers on civic engagement, Josh Clark writes that one of the lessons present across all of the papers in that collection is that effective engagement should begin not with a preset endpoint, e.g. voting, but with constituents approached on their own terms and as whole persons. So we know we are in, you know, an incredibly challenging moment of crisis. November is a completely uncertain, if not very scary, prospect at this moment. And so for some people, this might mean mourning, it might mean shock, it might mean high stress. And so we're having to be really kind to ourselves in different ways. Whether you have kids or don't have kids, whether you have work or you've lost work, whether you're healthy or have sick, you're caring for people, grief, separation, issues of mental health, relationships, all of these things are present in this moment that we're juggling. But we also know that this is not necessarily a new moment for many people, and for many communities that have been oppressed and targeted by, you know, the systems that we have. And so we want to ask and think about what values in your community have helped you through previous times of crisis. What are those values that you're pulling on right now? So that's going to be our first question in your breakouts in a moment. When we get into breakouts, is to think about, you know, what are those values from your community, from your culture, that have helped guide you through moments of crisis previously. And we'll drop those questions in the chat box as well. The second thing I want to raise is, you know, when they talk about some of the foundational meanings of the word apocalypse or other things like that, that word really means reveal, right? It's about reveal. And in these moments of reveal, oftentimes we see what was familiar all of a sudden become unfamiliar. We look at it anew and we shift what was previously thought was possible. So this is a practice that I take from the folklorist, Dr. Maribel Alvarez out of Arizona. And so in this moment, we are actually creating new norms, new responsibilities, new ways of being compassionate and caring and healing for each other. And so in that, we're having to show up as our whole selves and in relationship with our whole selves. What was previously seeming impossible is now having to become possible. We're seeing that on calls for moratoriums on eviction, rent cancellations, freeing prisoners, things like that. So the second question is, how are you taking this time, or how are you in this time having to show up as your whole self? What are you giving yourself permission to do in this moment? So we're going to jump into breakout rooms and be able to just take some time, a good amount of time, about 8 minutes with your partners, just to share, or with 3 people, what are the values from your culture or community that you're using to guide you through this moment? And what are the ways that you're allowing yourself to show up as your whole self in this moment right now in the context of COVID? So we'll switch over to breakout rooms right now. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll jump in there. Thank you. All right. Does anybody else want to share any values or you know, ways they're showing up right now that they'd like to share with us in this moment? If you do, just drop them feel free to drop them in the chat box as well as we go through it, as we continue to share those. But hopefully it was good to meet, connect with folks from around the country. Obviously, this is a really amazing group of people doing civic engagement, voter engagement work with racial justice focus and analysis to all this work. So hopefully, if nothing else, you're getting to meet new people. So we're going to jump in right now into kind of introducing the cultural strategy framework, and I will get going with that. So, all right. So a cultural strategy framework, the cultural strategy for belonging framework centers the leadership, voices, storytelling practices, and knowledge of people and communities who have been the target of oppressive ideologies and systems. A cultural strategy for belonging shifts whose knowledge and vision is made actionable in reshaping society. And this shift in what's made actionable in society is really essential because it's about a shift in power and it's about a shift in worldview. And I really want to emphasize that part about whose knowledge and vision is made actionable. This comes down to not only the questions, obviously, of representation, but perhaps more importantly, in what form that voice is made actionable. So, for example, New Orleans-based cultural strategist Sage Crump says that Toni Morrison's long-standing clarity around not writing for a white gaze is an action of cultural strategy. So it's not just about, again, it's not just about representation, it's about the language and audience of that representation and how that's made actionable. As the culture group writes in their kind of landmark report, if you haven't seen, called Making Waves, which came out a number of years ago, it's a great report on cultural strategy. What they write is that politics is where some of the people are some of the time, and culture is where most of the people are most of the time. So as we go through today, if there's something to hold on to, it's to think about where you're spending your time, how are you spending your time, and how your organizing might reflect this in the framework of culture and politics in that way. So as I get started here, I'm going to go through an abbreviated version of the 4 essential practices of cultural strategy for belonging. I'm going to pause for questions and then move into talking about how cultural strategy can specifically strengthen civic engagement efforts. Again, feel free to use the chat box. And I'm starting with these 4 essential practices, not because they necessarily give us clear instructions about how to apply or develop cultural strategy, but because they're kind of the pillars of a framework of cultural strategy that then later the specific activities can engage with. And we'll get into that a little bit later as we dive into specific attributes. So we'll keep moving here. If I can figure out, okay. Cool. So essential practice number 1 is to cultivate cultural practice and leadership. And so essentially this means building the power of people involved in the work by expanding notions of expertise and developing the capacity and skills for long-term engagement and leadership. It also means highlighting and amplifying existing leaders who work primarily in the space of culture. So think about something like Resilience Orange County's Week of Art and Resistance, or Leadership Institutes, Young Leaders Leadership Institutes. But a good question here to ask for civic engagement is, who am I overlooking or not seeing as relevant to civic engagement that is already doing the work of connecting and bringing people together through the routines and rituals of daily life? So who is doing that? Who is making meaning around individual and collective identity that isn't being pulled into or engaged with your organizing work and your efforts? Essential practice number 2 is to amplify the knowledge, insight, and vision that comes through culture on its own terms. And this goes back to Toni Morrison's point and her commitment to not writing for the white gaze. If we are cultivating leadership in diverse forms of practice, but then tightly curating the outcome, the language of its communication, its style, its aesthetics, its pacing, then we are actually transforming it in a way that is unrecognizable. The Midwest Culture Lab has pointed out that it's extremely easy for young people, especially, to call bullshit on things that are manipulated in these ways. And basically that's because it reflects a lack of trust and respect, which really plays on the bad practices of turnout for young voters of color. And so again, some good guiding questions for civic engagement around this practice is, how are you editing or polishing outcomes? And what are the forms of strategy or even respectability that you might be replicating or playing into by tightly curating what that outcome is and on whose terms it's being shared? Essential practice number 3 is to align with efforts for material, political, and social change, which is what we're doing here. Thinking about how you align those cultural strategy efforts with that so that they're not floating off by their own. Essential practice 4 is about making social and cultural change into a new common sense. So this means that cultural strategy efforts must also simultaneously engage strategic communications and narrative change work, and together that these can move through multiple spheres of life, the political, the economic, and the cultural. It also means building infrastructure for sharing this work at larger scales. And a lot of this is about resourcing, where we spend our time and energy. So those are 4, a quick overview of 4 of those practices. I'm going to stop the share real quick just so I can see some of the chat box and just see if anybody has any clarifying questions on that. And if anyone wants to drop in any of those, I'm looking through them right now. Otherwise, I'll keep pushing on. Thank you. Okay. All right. So let's see. Okay. So I want to start with this building block about when and why people vote, which is really coming from the research of Lisa Garcia Bedoya and Melissa Mickelson's work, Mobilizing Inclusion. And essentially, get out the vote campaigns are effective when an individual adopts a new characterization about themselves as a voter. So here, this is a version of the Pass the Brush challenge that's been going around right now during the pandemic with some of these cosplayers, and just a kind of fun play on the idea of adopting these new identities. So this seems simple enough, but it's foundational because it points to the role of identity and how one sees themselves in society. This means there's a shift in the story that one believes about themselves, and this identity is also tied to culture. So before we dive into this whole framework around identity, we obviously have to take a step back and frame this within the very real material conditions and infrastructure that are aligned to make voting criminalized, challenging, unpopular, or just plain impossible for many people, particularly low-income communities of color. So some of these barriers are intentional and systematic, such as voter purges or targeted media campaigns, which we know about. And some of them are rooted in the racist, ageist, and classist frameworks of establishment politicians and political bodies. So I just want to be really clear that what we're talking about isn't simply about individual agency, but it does reflect that the work to shift one's story about themselves as a voter is also working against structural conditions and structural push out and exclusion. Culture, similarly, is shaped by the economic, political, and social conditions of one's life. It isn't just about stories, symbols, practices. It's very interwoven with these economic, political, and social conditions. So while it's dynamic and multifaceted, it's produced through those conditions, and our identities likewise are shaped by that. So for communities the system has chronically attacked and failed, cultures that have been excluded, devalued, or delegitimized, there are logical reasons why civic engagement and voting is not part of one's identity. To make matters worse, civic engagement efforts frequently ask people to put aside their identity to adopt a new identity as a voter in order to advance a larger we without being guaranteed a seat at the table. At times, they are explicitly asked to not show up as their whole selves in whole communities, or to put this aside. Rarely have promises that have been made good. And I'm sure we all have experienced this or seen this happen in different ways. So in our strategic narrative efforts at the Institute, we look to create opportunities to connect identities as part of a larger narrative of who belongs. Cultural strategy strengthens this by expanding who shapes, co-creates, and leads within that larger we, and what the quality and texture of these stories, interactions, and actions look, taste, sound, and feel like, right? Again, this is going back to the whole self, all of our experiences in that way. In this sense, the goal is larger than trying to get people to vote, or even to adopt an individual identity as a voter. It's about seeing how one's identity and struggle is connected to others. It's about how that we might be both reflective of myself, but also large enough for others to live within as well. In fact, they might even benefit and strengthen each other. I always think back to the Zapatistas' reminder and framework that this effort is an effort to create a world in which many worlds fit. And to follow their work again, this really begins by listening, which is foundational to cultural strategy practice. So to extend a metaphor to what we're talking about here, we know that the soil is toxic. We know that it's underwatered. If you're in California in the Central Valley, we know we're in perpetual drought. There are lots of bugs and pests eating the plants. People are underpaid to do the work. But we are still trying to cultivate that seed, which in this case is identity, even with all of these conditions. So what are the values from my community and culture that shape that identity? What is the story about myself that I believe? And where is my identity the same as a larger collective identity, and where is it distinct? So as we navigate the pests and try to mend the soil, we also have to focus on cultivating and caring for that seed. So specifically, it is the change in the shift in the story that happens when people adopt a characterization about voting. And this again is coming from this research with Lisa Garcia Bedoya and Melissa Mickelson, is that feelings of self-worth and political efficacy begin to shift. And this makes a lot of sense to me. if what I do has no worth, if it has no impact, why would I do it? It only reinforces a feeling of a lack of power and invisibility to do something repeatedly and get no response from it. So here we see Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, doing voter registration efforts in Lowndes County, Alabama. So folks may know the history of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, or the LCFO, but they were a really dynamic, powerful civic engagement effort. 5 years after they were founded, when there was only one person in the county, one Black person in the county who was registered to vote, whose name was John Hewlett. 5 years later, he was elected as the county sheriff. And the impacts of their voter registration and civic engagement efforts are long-term. Black voters and Black women in particular, especially in Lowndes County, were a decisive demographic in the first election of a Democratic senator in the state in 25 years. So what were some of the things that worked with them? And I think of the LCFO as employing many attributes of cultural strategy. So they based their work in people's social and cultural contexts, their daily routines, in kitchens and on front porches. They originated the Black Panther symbol, which you can see on the flyer here in the lower right corner, as a symbol that developed a community identity that was distinct and in opposition to the dominant one, which was a white rooster for the Alabama Democratic Party, which was explicitly white supremacist. They used media forms such as comic books in a county that was highly illiterate, written literacy. By rooting their work in an existing cultural context, they were also able to put forward a relevant, aspirational collective identity that was political and cultural. It was a longer and broader project of individual and collective empowerment rather than a simple transaction towards voting. And in terms of effectiveness for what some people call low propensity voters, or what Ibram X. Kendi calls the other swing voters, the social and cultural context of this contact and interaction really matters. We know that issues are not enough to catalyze a shift in identity. And it isn't even just about person-to-person contact versus the calls or the flyers or digital advertising. Though we know that person-to-person contact is the most effective, with that the effectiveness going down in terms of those different outreach efforts. But one of the X factors that really shapes this is that the social and cultural context of this contact and interaction is essential for the effectiveness of the adoption of viewing oneself as a voter. So I want to lift up two examples that I really love. The first is the Black Joy Brunch series that was put forward by Color of Change, which they really framed around a goal around empowering Black joy. And they're very explicit about this and thinking about this. In those events, they write, we created a space where Black folks from all walks to enter into community with one another, to share their stories and discuss the importance of the upcoming elections. At these events, we danced to the wobble. We took selfies at our flower wall, laughed until we cried, and built strong relationships by launching squads committed to mobilizing voters after the brunch was over. The second example, which you see down below, is the Cultural Ambassadors Program, which we worked on. We had the honor of working on with Power California, 99 Roots, Resilience Orange County, and Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. And these were really engagement efforts organized around connecting community members through culturally specific vehicles, such as the Civic Engagement Workshop that you see here, which included Oaxacan dance, paper making with seeds that thrive in California and Mexico, and printmaking of handmade messages from door-to-door outreach efforts. And this workshop was designed by Yunadit Valencia, who you see there in the front left, and also Jazz Diaz, who's a great artist in the Central Valley. So in both of these events, in both of these projects, the specificity and attention to cultural context is essential. And this shows up in the style of the event, the context, the framing, the pacing. And it's particularly also shows up in the ideas of empowering joy and strengthening cultural identity. Again, research shows that, and this follows research, right? Because it's embedded in this kind of cultural knowledge, that framing a voter campaign around anger can actually be demobilizing for people of color, and particularly for Black voters. So I want to pause here just to say that a lot of this is probably not new. It may not be totally new for you. But it's a reminder that as we do our work, as we get caught up in the immediacy of our efforts, how are our activities and actions reflecting these best practices, the evidence that's coming forward with this work? How are we resourcing this? And reminding ourselves again that if politics is where some of the people are some of the time, and culture is where most of the people are most of the time, where are we spending our time and how are we spending our time? So finally, I want to frame that personal identity is never isolated, right? And I think we know this. This is nothing new. But who we are, who I am, is shaped by these social and cultural contexts. But even if we know that that's not true, this isn't always the story we tell about ourselves. Individualism is one of the most pernicious and tenacious stories in the US. And so a number of the partners on this call have worked with Gerald and others to develop workshops around individualism and breaking that. And it's incredibly challenged to break that story, right? And the story of individualism that way. One of the ways to do this is to think about larger collective aspirational identities, which can then be mobilizing, long-term, and sticky. And so here you see two very powerful examples of kind of mobilizing around collective identity. The earlier Legalize Arizona or campaigns with a poster by Fabiana Rodriguez, Undocumented and Unafraid, and then later the work around UndocuQueer, here a poster by Julio Salgado. So we also know that within this kind of collective aspirational identity, two of the key purposes are key motivating factors are around community purpose and civic duty. These kind of mobilize people, motivate people to vote. So for example, in focus groups that we've conducted, we find that people are motivated to vote for their younger siblings, their aunt who's in prison, their parents who are undocumented or not US citizens, even if that individual doesn't see voting as meaningful for themselves. So to go back to our seed metaphor, it's like a practice that I do when I plant called companion planting, where certain plants are cultivated next to each other in order to help each other grow. So for example, when I plant my tomatoes, I always plant basil because the basil actually helps repel the pests that attack the tomatoes. And then also they taste really good together when you harvest them. So this question of what stories are planted next to each other that help each other grow. So I want to close this part of it just by talking a little bit about inclusion and belonging. And I want to offer a word of warning here and highlight that this is where cultural strategy particularly can help civic engagement work. This goes back to the title of the workshop, Who Are You Calling We? And this title is actually taken from an essay called What Do You Mean We, White Man? It's by one of the most important leaders for Hawaiian sovereignty, Hanani K. Trask, whose work really sees no separation between cultural and political strategy. And in that essay, she's pushing back against this idea of kind of a predetermined collective identity, right? One that's coming from top down as a way to say that people are acting on behalf of Native Hawaiians, Indigenous Hawaiians. So in civic engagement efforts and progressive agendas more broadly, too often we start with essential practice number 4, the idea of the creation of a new status quo, a new quote unquote we, when the work hasn't actually been done to create a world where many worlds fit through our actions and practices. So Josh, in the civic engagement collection of papers, Josh points this out in Alicia Garza's essay, where she writes that far too often progressive agendas expect people situated at the intersections of multiple forms of oppression not to bring their own fight, but to join another's fight, and one whose success will ultimately not be measured against their lived experiences. Efforts that engage on those terms are bound to fail. They are themselves oppressive, and the persons they attempt to recruit know it. Ibram X. Kendi identifies this in a different way in a recent article about the other swing voter, where he writes, in our political environment, young Black voters receive lectures on the importance of voting, while white swing voters receive memos on the importance of candidates. In other words, young Black voters are encouraged to vote, while white swing voters are encouraged to vote for candidates, end quote. So in other words, white swing voters have agency and identity, while young Black voters are pawns who need to be turned out to vote. So this is when we get stuck at the limitations of inclusion. And as you can see from this diagram, the shape is set and there is a predetermined place for each of the colorful dots in the circle. Even when the dots move inside, they sit within that original structure of the circle there. Cultural strategy helps us move to belonging instead of inclusion, particularly through essential practices 1 and 2. This means, number 1, cultivating diverse forms of cultural practice and the growth of leadership. And number 2, it means amplifying this cultural practice and knowledge and wisdom on its own terms. And this is really important because it reflects a respect and a trust for people and ways of being that are marginalized and pushed out, and the way that that's replicated within civic engagement efforts. So this is why we started with these questions of community values and how we show up as our whole selves, because this is the grounding for how cultural strategy can reorient or strengthen civic engagement efforts. This allows us to move from exclusion to belonging instead of getting stuck at mere inclusion. And this is really based in trusting the people, community, and culture that we work with. It requires trusting what you know as real for yourself, what gets you excited, what connects you to people, and using the wisdom in the work. Who are you writing off? What are you holding back that is important to you? That doesn't mean we have to accept everything from culture blindly. We know that there are oppressive tendencies in all of our lives and communities. But if I can't show up as me and I'm a leader in a certain space, I'm showing people it's not okay for them to be themselves either. And similarly, oftentimes our tactics and activities will reflect this and fail to create belonging that is rooted enough to change the structure of that first circle into something much more beautiful and expansive here. So I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions. It's hard for me to follow along the chat while talking, but if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat box, or feel free to just raise your hand with the reactions icon, or the raise your thumb, I guess is how we're doing it.
I'd like to get some reactions of how you're receiving this. Is it useful? Are there clarifications that you need?
Cool. Thanks, Polo. And we can share out these slides and some of the talking points after the call as well, with some of the links also.
If you use your thumbs up icon, we can unmute you and you can talk to us.
So Jen, it looks like Jen has a question. Go ahead, Jen.
So I actually didn't have a question. I just wanted to say that I do find this very useful, especially in thinking about how we approach November, and how a lot of the community that I work with is the Latino community, and it's often mixed status and is often spoken to as like a just get out and vote, as opposed to all of this. So I found this extremely interesting, and I'm really excited to share this information with the tables that I'm on when it comes to how we're approaching going into November.
Great. Thank you, Jen. We had a question from Victor around wondering how we can adapt to the current moment. Thank you, Victor. Yeah, and I don't have an answer for that, but that's what we're going to turn to right now, is to take some time to look at that. Kelvin noting that this is very helpful in providing racial equity perspective. And then Henry's asking, can you make a clear distinction between what you're calling an aspirational identity and a predetermined collective identity? Yeah, thank you, Henry, for that question. I think what I would share there is that there are ways that the kind of framing and communication around a quote unquote we, or a collective identity, for example, sometimes feels manufactured or manipulated, right? So sometimes you'll see that in kind of the perfect image of diversity, where you have every different identity type and in a picture as a way to kind of represent this future we, right? As opposed to that being something that's authentic and coming from the collection of people who are in a room and how they're producing it and generating that as themselves. And so one of the reasons I shared that first pass the brush challenge with the cosplayers, which is just short for costume players, for folks who are, is that we all have many different identities and ways of showing up. And so what are the ways that we create space for those authentic, selves to kind of come together and create that and produce that aspirational identity together. So I think that's where that difference comes through versus the predetermined collective identity, which is being set by, kind of a think tank or, something like that, as opposed to, or a communications team versus kind of coming through this cultural practice in that way. So, yeah, and Olivia is making comments on that as well. So I'm gonna keep us moving here. Thank you, Henry. I'm glad that was helpful. I'm gonna keep us moving here to kind of try to dig into this. So what I want us to do now is just take about 3 minutes, and this is for you all to do a little bit of writing work there where you are, just to identify 3 goals or challenges that you're really focused on in this moment with your civic engagement work. So just write them down quickly. Or you don't have to write them down, just write them in your brain. What are 3 kind of goals or challenges that are at the top of your head right now? Okay, and as you start to get those, maybe just choose one that you want to focus on for this next activity we're going to do. So if you have your 3, just underline or circle or, erase the others from your brain for a moment and just, identify the one that you really want to focus on. And ideally, this should be a concrete goal or a concrete challenge that you're focusing on right now. So even if it's about adapting to this moment, if you can try to dial in a little bit more about, what is it about adapting to this moment? Okay, cool. So I'm going to share a screen, and I'm also dropping in a link here in the chat box that focuses on what we're calling cultural strategy attributes. And these are attributes that, let me pull this up first and then I can focus. Okay, so are you all seeing this now?
Yes, it's not in present mode though.
Okay, so stop share.
There you go.
Great. Okay. So so we've kind of laid out a broad framework, but I want to give you this, which is basically 12, what I call 12 attributes of cultural strategy that can help us start to identify ways to approach some of those challenges and goals. And I've shared the link now in the chat box, and in a moment, I'm going to ask everyone to kind of click on that link and start to kind of go through this document on their own for a few minutes. But these are a collection of 12 attributes that can help us think about our goals around civic engagement efforts. So very briefly, number 1 is about insisting on humanness. This is an attribute of cultural strategy, the way we bring in kind of that vulnerability, subjectivity, fragility, and sacredness of what it means to be human. With each one of these attributes, there's also an example that goes with it, or a couple examples that go with it. So for example, here is a project by the Palestinian-born artist Emily Jassir, where she asked refugees in Jordan what they miss most about Palestine. And then because of her US passport, she was actually able to go to Palestine and carry out the task that people had asked her to do. So for example, here, somebody said, please play soccer with the first boy on the street that you see in Haifa. She did this and took the picture and then shared it out that way, right? So there's many examples like that throughout this project, but these are examples to kind of help us get us thinking and kind of spark some imagination around potential activities and projects. Number 2 is about reclaiming cultural memory. Examples in here. Number 3 is about validating and articulating marginalized value systems and ways of knowing. So various different examples that are kind of shared throughout here. There's 12 of them total, and if you can go through that link in the chat box. And so what, one of the things I want to note is that in this moment, most of these examples are actually about people being in contact with each other, right? And so obviously that's not our reality right now, and that's the big issue that we're focused on as we approach November. So as you think through this, I also want you to just kind of think about what things that you've been doing that have been connecting you most to other people in this moment. So some examples that I've been thinking about are things like that brush challenge, online dance parties I've been having with friends that I haven't danced with in years because they live in Baltimore or Detroit or wherever. DJ battles, the Instagram live DJ battles that have been going on. The SEIU nurse organizing, or some of the car protests that people have been engaged with. Recreating art from collections around the world. People have been connecting around things like that. So there's these different things as you go through these attributes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take we're running short on time, but we're going to take about 5-6 minutes just to kind of flip through that document and kind of click on that as you go through and kind of identify 1 or 2 of those attributes that you think is most interesting to you or might help you in addressing your challenge or goal. So take some time now. Are people able to access that link? Yeah? Okay. So as you click through that, just reading through the titles of each of the 12 attributes.
Should we be able to click on it? Because it's not going to we have to copy and paste.
Yeah, you may have to copy and paste. And then just kind of go through there, find 1 or 2 of the titles of the attributes that kind of resonate with you in this moment. Obviously, we're not going to have time for a deep dive on these, but just, kind of identify 1 or 2 of those right now. We'll take a couple minutes just to do that. In the interest of time and knowing that we hopefully will be able to dig in these, and now you've started to engage this resource a little bit, I want to bring us back together and try to keep us moving to this next phase. So this next question is, as we kind of dig into this, is to then, with longer time, what we would do is we would take those attributes that you have there, deepen into reading and thinking about those case studies, right? So if the focus of the work is around reclaiming cultural memory, or if it's about expanding reach, then we would think about finding other case studies that really lift that up, right? And taking those case studies and kind of remixing, reworking them in order to kind of motivate and move forward some ideas. But before we do that, what we do is we start with what are called an impossible ideas brainstorm, right? And so I think this is a kind of fun activity usually. I think it's a really important activity in this moment, especially, right? Because we're in a moment where what was previously seen as impossible is now a politics of the necessary, or a politics of the inevitable, right? We think about healthcare in this moment. How do we think about healthcare within a kind of politics of the necessary in this time? Paid time off, family leave, things like that. So what we're gonna do right now, we were gonna do this in breakouts. We have just a few more, we don't have that long, so I think we're gonna do this all together instead. But what I'm gonna do is we're gonna give 3 to 4 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to write down 5 impossible ideas that help you achieve the goal or address the challenge that you've identified. So they can be informed by these frameworks, that the attributes that we put forward. But I'd like you to try to come up with impossible ideas at this point, right? And I'm gonna caution you that probably the first ideas you do are not gonna be impossible. So you're gonna have to push farther and kind of move through those ideas, right? And I want to ground this in this moment that, I heard somebody saying the other day, we're going to have to completely reinvent. This was Kianga Yamada Taylor actually talking about this on a call with Naomi Klein and Astor Taylor. I'm not sure if other people were on that, but they were saying that, in this moment we have completely different contexts of organizing. How can we do person-to-person organizing? And they said, well, yeah, but sit-ins also were illegal at that moment. It wasn't possible for people to go and do sit-ins at that moment. But that was the strategy that was developed, that was used to do that, right? So take a few minutes now, write down 5 impossible ideas that could help you advance your goal or overcome the challenge that you've identified. Ready? Good to go? Go for it. Play some music while we brainstorm. If you've already got 5, keep going. Oftentimes it's the last idea that you get to that's the most exciting one. And read through them. You might get an idea that you think is possible. How can you push it to impossible? Or if you have an impossible idea, read it again. Is it actually impossible? All right, Calvin. What makes that impossible, Kelvin? You gotta keep pushing it. What's the way to get there? Yeah. All right, so we're gonna stop there, and I want to take a couple examples of impossible kind of ideas for cultural strategy projects that can help you advance your goal or address your challenge. So, does anybody have a couple that they'd like to share? Thank you for the folks who have been sharing in the chat box. Does anybody have one that they'd like to share, either in others that they'd like to share in the chat box or over the phone? Don't be shy, y'all. This is the time we get to share ideas together. And I'll say it's very weird for me to facilitate it in person, you know, like this in this way, because usually we get to be with each other. We catch each other's energy. So please bring some of that back. Who's got an idea that they're excited about? All right, so we got Valerie, craft a model to share issues and then model to share responses along our grid, evaluate issues using metrics we've already developed, then send out to vote. Okay, and Olivia said general strike. Some other ones, does anybody have a couple more? So Valerie, can you say, well, let's find, I'm trying to find you on the thing here, Valerie. Oh, there you are, okay. Valerie, would you mind sharing just a little bit more what you're saying there? Craft model to share issues and then model to share responses along our grid?
Sure. What we had developed a calendar and we're coming up we had been coming up within the next 6 weeks or so to hold our issues convention. And at the issues convention, we have our members and our member organizations discuss issues they'd like to see us work on collectively. Mm-hmm. And then we we evaluate those on our grid and then vote on those. And from there we create our strategies to move ahead.
Okay.
But it seems like a very challenging task when we can't meet collectively.
Yep. Okay. Great. Thank you. So yeah, challenging and then impossible, right? So if we think about some of the ways, if we start to think about some of the examples, for example, even if we were to take the existing example of the Pass the Brush challenge, and think about how you might do something like that with the Pass the Brush challenge, mm-hmm. right? So say for example, we take that challenge and we say Pass the Pen challenge, and we create videos where people write, and I'm just brainstorming, right? But this is the process of how this starts to happen, is we think about these ways that people are connecting, right? So part of what the challenge is in this moment that you're facing is the ability for people to kind of be together, right? So if we think of that case study of that Pass the Brush challenge, that maybe that way that we're connecting in that moment is, you know, people are writing what their issues are on a paper, they have the pen, and then they throw the pen, right? And then that goes, in my screen is next is Phelan, and the pen goes to Phelan catches it, and you write down what your thing, and then Phelan throws it to Gerald, right? So it's thinking about ways that we might explore some of those. There's a couple other examples here. You know, Olivia put out general strike, right? So one way we would start to work with that is you think about, okay, so a general strike, you know, there have been moments of general strike in the US history, right? In Seattle, there have been efforts of that in Oakland. What are some of the symbols from that, right? So this is about reclaiming cultural memory. If we look at the cultural strategy attributes and think, okay, so these are efforts to reclaim cultural memory, right? How do we pull some of that forward into this existing moment to kind of help frame and provoke the imagination around that general strike? Are there ways that a general strike can happen via Zoom, right? Is there a way that all of a sudden if people turn off the internet for a day or they do, you know, things like that, right? And so it's these ways of kind of taking these ideas and moving them back and forth between what has already come, what people have already done in the struggle for freedom, for racial justice, right? And kind of thinking about how can we remix and reuse those within this current moment, right? And so this framework around identifying the goals and challenges, then using the attributes to kind of address and think about those as a way to then kind of identify case studies that you can kind of pull into that, is a way to spark the imagination and play with those ideas, right? And so what I noticed even what I noticed in these ideas that are coming forward is that our ideas are very much focused on concrete policy wins or actions or activities, right? And so even with that, it's thinking about what are the cultural strategy attributes or elements that play into these ideas, right? How can we kind of bring those kinds of things into these impossible ideas as we move them forward? So what we would do if, you know, in a longer session, as we would develop some of these ideas and go through them, is then we would think about how are our values showing up in this, right? How are our whole selves showing up in this? So if we're thinking about a general strike, if we're thinking about the kind of, you know, the idea that Valerie brought forward around kind of catching all the issues and ideas, how are the values that helped us guide through other crises being informed in there? Can we integrate those in some kind of way, right? Maybe there's a different kind of cultural form of gathering, Valerie, that you're connected to that could then be shaped around this. Maybe it's something around cooking. Maybe it's something around song, right? How can that be integrated into the way that people are connecting? We would also want to think about how are these bringing forward an existing worldview, right? So how are they kind of replicating something maybe that we don't want to replicate, right? Where are the politics of, you know, some form of respectability or some kind of, you know, different kinds of gaze kind of coming into that, right? G-A-Z-E in that way, right? And so we kind of have these additional questions that we ask ourselves as we go through this as a way to kind of guide and shape this, moving those forward. So those are some of the opportunities, you know, as we kind of develop these ideas to kind of sculpt them. So I think of these ideas really as like a big block of wood, and then we keep asking these questions to cut them down. And so what I want to share, just as we kind of move this forward, is that there are some of these resources that exist on our website that are this entire workshop exists on that website, particularly the second half of the workshop. If you're interested in kind of doing this with members, people that you work with, as a way to kind of help them develop ideas and think about that, right? And I would say that this is really the core, right? I mean, it's for us as kind of lead organizers and heads of organizations to think through this, but also how are we doing this with your members, with the folks you're working with, in order to develop those ideas and develop that leadership, right? And so this is the process that we use. This is the process we have used as a way to kind of generate ideas. We use this in civic engagement. We use different forms of this around development policies, development projects, planning, housing, things like that as well. So I want to just, I'll stop there. If there's anything that, this was very quick, 90 minutes to get through a lot. If folks are interested in a kind of deeper webinar, a part 2 to kind of really flesh out these ideas. And I think, you know, we can spend some time really intentionally focusing on this moment and this framework, and, you know, the kind of pandemic moment. I think that, you know, I would love to kind of host that and be back with you all and kind of think about how we might share that space and time together. I want to just pause if there's any, questions, feedback at this moment in the chat box. Otherwise, we will share out the links that we've shared today so far. We hope that if you are interested in continuing this conversation, that we can continue to do that. And I'll stop there. Gerald, Olivia, Josh, any last thoughts or questions?
I just want to thank everyone for joining with us, and please know that we do want to continue to interact with you around these ideas about cultural strategy and civic engagement. And there's a lot of resources on both those topics on our website, both in the Blueprint for Belonging project and the civic engagement narrative strategy project. So I would encourage you to go to those websites and explore what's on there.
Great. Yeah, and if you connected with the folks on the call or are interested in connecting with folks, let us know and we can check in with folks and see if it's okay to connect you and all of that kind of stuff as well. But obviously, I think if nothing else, it's a beautiful reflection of people doing this work right now, and holding each other in this struggle in this moment. As you can hear a baby outside crying, you know, we're all in our lives, we're all in our moments, wherever we are. So, you know, just much gratitude to all of you. And as we really kind of try to push the boundaries of what's normal in these next few months, and allowing ourselves to not have to show up with perfectionism, you know, which is really just a, you know, some people say it's just a symptom of white supremacy in that way, and move past that and think about how we want to do this work, and, you know, in your own reflection, in our own reflection, and a reflection of a world that's more about belonging. So thank you all very much. And, you know, feel free to reach out, and hope to talk to you soon.